You want to know what 25 years of my life looks like? It looks like a complex web of heavy copper cables, 3,000 gallons of dielectric insulating oil, and a constant low-frequency hum that vibrates in your jawbone even when you are sleeping. My name is Gavin Miller. I am 55 years old, and I do not have a fancy title that fits neatly on a digital resume. For a quarter of a century, I have been the Chief Industrial Power Systems Engineer for Vance Metals, a massive, heavy smelting plant located in the industrial heart of the Midwest. It is a place that consumes electricity the way a starving predator tears through fresh meat. I am the sole reason the lights do not flicker across the county when our colossal electric arc furnaces kick on. I am the reason the main substation transformer did not turn into a metal crater during the historic ice storm of 2018. I am the quiet, unyielding spine of this entire operation. The workers on the casting floor do not call maintenance when the transformer hum changes, they call me. If Gavin is walking slowly with coffee, the world is fine. If Gavin is running, you run too. The plant is not just a collection of brick buildings. It is a living, breathing, temperamental beast that must be fed exactly 13.8 kilovolts of clean power, or it throws a tantrum that costs tens of thousands of dollars for every single minute of downtime. I know every single one of its moods. I know that switchgear B becomes unresponsive when the winter humidity drops below 40%, and I know that the emergency backup generators have a 2-second synchronization lag that terrifies the corporate accountants but is perfectly manageable if you manually feather the electrical load distribution. Then came Julian Vance. Julian is the son of the company founder, Charles Vance. Julian is 32 years old, wears Italian wool suits that cost more than my pickup truck, and carries a polished smile that looks like it was carefully calibrated by a marketing team. He took over operations 6 months ago when his father, old Charles, finally retired to Florida. Julian does not know a volt from a bolt. He believes that industrial efficiency is a magical product you can buy off the shelf in a software package. He struts around the hot casting floor with a glossy tablet, frowning at heavy machinery he does not comprehend. I saw the writing on the wall about 2 months into his modernizing campaign. Julian started bringing in outside efficiency consultants. They were young kids with business degrees who looked at a blast furnace operating at nearly 1,000 degrees and asked if we could reduce the electrical costs by simply turning the temperature down during peak hours. I watched them circle my department like sharks that had never seen open water. Gavin, Julian said to me one Tuesday morning, standing in the doorway of my control room. He did not come inside. No one from the administrative block likes to step inside my office. It is kept at a constant temperature of 60 degrees to keep the monitoring servers happy, and it smells strongly of ozone and soldering flux. We are reviewing the annual operational budget, Julian continued. Your department is looking extremely heavy, I asked, keeping my eyes fixed on the power monitors. The municipal grid was fluctuating wildly. The local utility provider was experiencing a regional brownout, and I was manually adjusting our massive capacitor banks to keep the voltage drop from tripping the main circuit breakers. It is like attempting to land a massive commercial airliner on a moving ship during a storm. Expensive, Julian clarified, tapping his shiny shoe. You have 3 assistants, an overtime budget that rivals the entire sales team, and frankly, looking at these digital charts, the entire grid management seems automated. Why are we paying for manual engineering oversight on a system that is supposed to run itself? I finally turned my chair around. I took a slow sip of my coffee that had been sitting on the desk since 4 in the morning. It was cold and bitter. Julian, I said, using his first name because I had metaphorically changed his diapers when he was an intern here. The system runs itself the way a steam engine runs itself. It works wonderfully until the water pressure builds up and it explodes. Those automated controllers are 2 decades old. Their logic circuits are held together by customized software patches I wrote in a programming language that does not even exist in modern textbooks. You are not paying me to watch lights blink. You are paying me so that when the municipal grid spikes, I know precisely which circuit breaker to sacrifice so the entire smelting line does not go dark and freeze, Julian smirked. That arrogant, bright white smirk that made my teeth grind. That sounds like typical union job security jargon to me, Gavin. We are modernizing this facility. We need lean operations. We need synergy. I absolutely despise the word synergy. If you cut my budget, you cut the safety net that keeps this place alive, I told him flatly. Do you have any idea what happens if the aluminum smelters lose power for more than 15 minutes? We have emergency backups. Julian waved his hand dismissively. The backups take 12 minutes to synchronize without manual intervention, because the phase converters are constantly drifting, I explained. That leaves you a tiny 3-minute window. If you miss that window, the molten metal in those pots cools down and turns into a 10-ton brick of solid aluminum. You would have to jackhammer it out. It takes months to rebuild. It costs $50 million. You are being dramatic to protect your salary. Julian sighed, checking his luxury watch. Just justify your department on paper, Gavin. I need a complete report by Friday. I wrote a 40-page report detailing every near catastrophe I had averted, including a thermal runaway in May and a harmonic distortion loop in June. I laid it out like an autopsy of a disaster that never occurred, knowing Julian would only skim for bottom-line figures. The plant atmosphere shifted. Technicians stopped making eye contact, sensing layoffs. I kept the system stable but cleaned out my private drive, deleting my personal engineering notes. These were the cheat sheets, the small text files where I had recorded the unique quirks of the machinery. Details like how turbine number 3 vibrates at 60 Hz but is dampened at 58 Hz, or how feeder number 4 runs hot and you must ignore the automated alarm until it reaches 90 degrees. These were crucial details that lived in my fingertips, not in the official manuals. I deleted them one by one. If I was considered operational drag, I should shed my weight. Yesterday morning, the digital summon arrived in my inbox. It was a calendar invitation titled Restructuring Discussion. There was no agenda attached. It was just Julian, myself, and the Human Resources Director, a woman named Brenda Cole. I put on my best flannel shirt and my cleanest pair of work boots. I walked through the factory floor on my way to the administration block. I touched the cold steel of a support column as I passed. It was a silent goodbye. The guys on the floor nodded at me, sensing what was coming. I walked into the glass-walled conference room. It was not empty, which was the first violation of the unwritten code. You fire a senior engineer in private, not in front of an audience. But Julian wanted a show. Sitting around the mahogany table were the department heads of sales logistics, and 3 of those fresh-faced efficiency consultants tapping on their tablets. "Gavin, have a seat," Julian said, gesturing to a chair at the far end of the table. He sat at the head, in front of a projector displaying a slide titled Legacy Costs and Operational Drag. I remained standing. I prefer to stand, Julian. My knees lock up if I sit in cheap corporate chairs for too long. A nervous silence filled the room. Julian's smile tightened. "Suit yourself," he said, tapping a key on his computer. The slide changed to display a breakdown of my salary, my health benefits, and the overtime hours of my small team. It was a gross violation of privacy, projected in high resolution for everyone to see. As you can see, Julian addressed the room. The engineering oversight department is bleeding our operational margins. We are paying a premium for manual intervention in an era of digital automation. Gavin, effective immediately, your position is being eliminated. We are transitioning to a cloud-based grid monitoring solution. A cloud-based solution? I repeated, the words tasting like ash. You are going to run a 40-year-old heavy industrial plant from a remote server? What happens when the network latency hits 500 milliseconds and the phase synchronization drifts? The redundancy protocols handle the latency, one of the young consultants piped up in a squeaky voice. The algorithm corrects the drift. I laughed. It was a dry, harsh sound. The algorithm? Kid. The algorithm does not know that smelter number 3 has a microscopic crack in its induction coil that creates a massive harmonic feedback loop every time the external temperature drops. The algorithm does not know you have to ramp up the voltage slowly on Tuesdays because the utility company performs a grid switch that causes a transient voltage spike. That sounds like folklore, Julian cut in, his voice cold. We operate on data, Gavin, not folklore. I took a step toward the table. I have kept this facility from burning to the ground 3 times this year. You call it folklore, I call it electrical physics. If you fire me, You lose the only person who speaks the language of this machinery. Enough. Julian slammed his hand on the mahogany table. This is a notification, not a negotiation. Your network access has been revoked. Security will escort you out. He slid a packet of papers across the table. This is your severance. 2 weeks of pay for every year of service, provided you sign this agreement waiving all future claims and transferring all intellectual property rights. I looked at the contract. My eyes caught the clauses. They wanted me to sign away the copyright to the custom fail-safe software patches I had written and registered 15 years ago under the federal copyright law, specifically Section 106 of Title 17 of the United States Code. I had only granted the company a non-transferable personal license to use those patches while I was employed. By firing me, that license terminated. If they kept running my code, it was copyright infringement. I will not sign this, I said, pushing the papers back, and without my signature, this agreement is void. Furthermore, attempting to coerce me under threat of withholding my earned severance makes this entire document void ab initio under the law. Get out! Julian hissed. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my key card, and tossed it onto the table. It landed with a loud plastic clack. I will leave, I said, but here is some free advice. The smelters run on a buffered power supply that must be manually calibrated every 4 hours to account for grid drift. I did the last calibration at 8 this morning. It is now 11:30. In exactly 30 minutes, the electrical drift will exceed the safety threshold. The automated system will try to correct it, but it will fail because the sensors on pot line 3 are fouled with carbon dust. I was going to clean them after lunch. You have 30 minutes, Julian. Good luck. I walked slowly to the parking lot, taking in the thud of the stamping presses and the hiss of the steam valves one last time. It was an industrial symphony I had conducted for 25 years, and now I was leaving. But I had one critical stop to make. My truck was parked near the auxiliary control shed, a small brick bunker that houses the manual overrides for the substation. Inside are the physical circuit breakers that connect the plant to the municipal electrical grid. I still had the physical brass keys to the door on my keychain. Julian, in his haste to throw me out, had only deactivated my electronic key card. He forgot about the physical security. Inside the cool, dark bunker, the deafening hum of the transformers pressed against my eardrums. I approached the control panel and located the switch labeled Auto Sync Override. The software Julian loved so much always tries to synchronize our internal electrical frequency with the municipal grid, but the municipal grid fluctuates constantly. If the software detects too much variance, it panics and shuts down to protect the system. To prevent this, I always kept the override switch in the manual position. It forced the system to ignore the minor jitters and stay online. If I flipped it back to auto, the computer would take over. And since I had deleted my custom code patches from the local drive, the software would see the natural grid fluctuations, assume a catastrophic failure was occurring, and trip the master breakers. It would not happen immediately. The system sampling cycle takes about 10 minutes to validate the error. I reached out and grabbed the cold plastic handle of the switch. You wanted automation, Julian, I whispered to the dark room. Now you have it. I flipped the switch from manual to auto. A small red warning light illuminated on the panel, replacing the steady green light. The hum of the transformers did not change, and the lights did not dim. To anyone else, it looked as though nothing had happened. But I knew the truth. I had just engaged a digital autopilot that did not know the runway had ended. I stepped out, locked the door, and walked to my old pickup truck. As I climbed into the cab, I saw Jerry, the chief of security, driving past in his golf cart. He waved at me. Leaving early, Gavin? He called out. Yes, Jerry, I replied, taking a permanent vacation. Julian's decision, Jerry looked confused, gesturing toward the humming factory buildings. What about the systems? Not my concern anymore, Jerry, I said, starting the engine. But do me a personal favor. Do not ride the freight elevator in the casting tower for the next hour. Take the stairs. Why? Jerry asked, frowning. Just trust me on this one, I said, putting the truck in gear and driving slowly out of the parking lot. I drove at the speed limit, wanting to be miles away when the systems collapsed at exactly 11:52. I pulled out a cigarette, lit it, and took a deep drag. My phone sat in the cup holder, At 11:51, it began to vibrate. It was a text message from Audrey, my assistant. "Gavin, the voltage monitors are fluctuating wildly," she wrote. "The phase angle is shifting. What should I do?" I did not respond. I picked up the phone, held down the power button, and shut it off completely. I turned onto the highway, watching the factory fade in my rearview mirror. It looked massive and peaceful, venting white steam into the sky. "You have exactly 15 minutes, Julian," I thought. "You had better find a very large crowbar, because you are going to need it to pry your career out of the hardened aluminum." I did not go home. Instead, I drove to O'Malley's, a quiet dive bar 5 miles up the road that smells of old wood and draft beer. It was just after noon on a Tuesday. The only people inside were myself, a quiet regular sleeping at a corner table, and the bartender, a woman named Barb. "Afternoon, Gavin," Barb said, wiping the counter. "Aren't you supposed to be keeping the lights on Advanced Metals?" "I was, Barb," I said, sitting on a wooden stool. "But I am retired now, effective immediately. Give me a whiskey and a cold beer." Barb raised her eyebrows but poured the drinks. I took the shot of whiskey. It was warm and grounded me. I set my phone face down on the bar. Even though it was turned off, I felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. At 12:10, I turned the phone back on just to see the storm. The screen immediately lit up with missed calls and messages. There were 12 calls from Julian, 8 from the Human Resources Office, and 5 from the plant's emergency line. Audrey's texts were desperate. "Gavin, the master breaker tripped. The backup generator started, but it will not connect to the bus. The frequency is oscillating." Then came a text from Julian, his arrogance completely gone. "Gavin, pick up. We have an emergency. The smelters have lost power." His next message was angry. "If you do not call me back right now, I will ensure you never work in this industry again. I will sue you for sabotage." I smiled and took a sip of my beer. Sue me for what? I had simply returned the machinery to its original, factory-approved automatic settings and removed my personal intellectual property. Under the law, they had no right to use my custom code without a license anyway. The only person committing a crime was Julian, who was currently violating my federal copyright by trying to run my proprietary software patches to restore the grid. I had the registration certificates in a safety deposit box. He was walking directly into a legal trap. By 12:30, the situation at Advanced Metals must have been terrifying. I did not need to be there to picture it. Without electrical power, the massive aluminum smelting pots were cooling rapidly. The molten aluminum inside them was kept at 960 degrees Celsius purely by the massive current flowing through the line. The moment the power stopped, the thermal clock began ticking. At 5 minutes, the electromagnetic fields holding the molten metal in suspension collapsed. At 15 minutes, the surface of the liquid metal would begin to crust over, forming a solid shell. At 2 hours, the pots would freeze solid. Once a pot freezes, it is ruined. The metal contracts and breaks the delicate carbon lining. You cannot simply turn the power back on to melt it. You have to physically destroy the pot with jackhammers, clear out the solid metal blocks, and rebuild the entire structure from scratch. Rebuilding a single pot costs approximately $300,000. Advanced Metals had 100 pots in operation. That was $30 million in physical damage alone, not including the millions in lost production and the massive $20 million contract penalties for failing to deliver raw materials to our automotive clients. Julian was staring at a $70 million disaster. At 12:45, a heavy black sedan pulled into the gravel parking lot of O'Malley's. I watched through the dusty window as Preston Howard, the senior member of the board of directors and the primary financial partner of Charles Vance, stepped out of the car. He looked disheveled, his tie crooked and his face pale with sweat. He opened the door of the bar, blinked in the dim light, and spotted me immediately. He marched over to my stool. "Gavin, thank God," Preston gasped, gripping the edge of the bar. "You have to come back to the plant right now. The pot line is freezing. The temperature is down to 840 degrees. We have less than 20 minutes before the crust becomes too thick to break." I did not turn to look at him. I took a slow sip of my beer. "I am retired, Preston. Julian made it very clear that my services are no longer required. He has a cloud-based solution. Why don't you call his consultants?" "Julian is an idiot," Preston shouted, his voice cracking. The board has already suspended him. We have escorted him out of the operations office. But the engineers we have on site do not know how to bypass the automated lockout. Audrey says you are the only one who knows the manual codes. I turn my stool to face him. Julian is not the only problem, Preston. You signed the budget cuts. You approved the elimination of my department to save a few $1,000s on paper. You risked a $70 million asset because you wanted to show the shareholders a higher margin. This is not just Julian's failure. It is yours. Preston looked as though he had been struck. He wiped his forehead with a trembling hand. Gavin, please. If the plant freezes, we will go bankrupt. 500 people will lose their jobs. The local community will be devastated. Think about the workers. Think about Saul and Mikey. They have families. I stared at him. He was using the workers as a shield, but he was right about one thing. I cared about the guys on the floor. I had worked alongside them for 25 years. I was not going to let them suffer for the greed of the board. I want a new contract, Preston, I said, my voice cold and firm. Anything, Preston said instantly. Name your terms. I want an independent consulting agreement, I said. My rate is $350 per hour. I want a guaranteed minimum of 1,500 hours per year, contractually secured for the next 5 years. That contract must be signed by the board and sent to my email before I set foot in the plant. Preston nodded rapidly. Yes, we can do that. I will call legal right now. That is not all, I continued. I want full operational autonomy. No administrators or consultants in my control room. I report directly to the board, not to operations. And finally, I want Julian Vance to meet me at the front gate. I want him to hand me my new security badge, and I want him to apologize to me in front of the entire maintenance crew. Preston hesitated. Gavin, Julian is the founder's son. Then his father can watch the company dissolve, I said, turning back to my beer. The temperature is dropping. Preston, you are losing $1 million every minute you stand here debating his pride. Preston pulled out his phone and began screaming at the legal department. 5 minutes later, my phone buzzed with an email notification. It was the digital contract, signed by the chairman of the board. It is done, Preston said, his voice shaking. Julian is waiting at the gate. Let's go. I finished my beer, stood up, and grabbed my jacket. Let's go save your company, I said. When we arrived at the main gate of Vance Metals, the scene was absolute chaos. Emergency vehicles were parked along the road, their red lights flashing against the gray steel buildings. A large crowd of workers had gathered near the security fence, talking in whispered, anxious groups. Standing right at the gate was Julian. He looked completely broken. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his hair was messy, and his face was red with embarrassment. I got out of Preston's car and walked up to him. The workers fell silent, watching us. Julian looked at me, his teeth clenched. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a new gold-plated security badge. He held it out to me. I am sorry, Gavin, he muttered, looking at the ground. I made a mistake. I did not take the badge. I cannot hear you, Julian. The emergency venting valves are quite loud. Julian swallowed hard, his face turning an even darker shade of red. I am sorry, Gavin, he yelled, his voice echoing across the courtyard. I was wrong. You were right. Please save the plant. I took the badge from his hand, pinned it to my flannel shirt, and walked past him through the gate. The workers began to murmur, and Saul gave me a thumbs up from the crowd. I walked into the control room. The air was thick with the smell of hot electrical insulation. Audrey was at the main console, her hands hovering over the keyboard in frustration. The 3 consultants were cowering in the corner, staring at their tablets like useless statues. Get out of my control room, I told the consultants. They did not hesitate. They grabbed their bags and ran out the door. Audrey, report, I said, sitting in the primary engineering chair. The master breaker is locked out, Audrey explained quickly. The backup generator is running, but the phase synchronization is drifting by almost 120 degrees. The automated software is stuck in a reboot loop because it cannot resolve the frequency mismatch. I cracked my knuckles. Watch closely, Audrey. I will show you how to handle a stubborn machine. I bypassed the automated software entirely, using the command terminal to kill the synchronization process. The screens went dark for 3 seconds, then refreshed with raw data. The reboot loop was broken. Now I had to manually synchronize the backup generator. I watched the phase monitor, waiting for the two sine waves to align. Audrey, go to the rear manual breaker panel, I instructed. When I say mark, pull the manual charging handle on breaker 3. Audrey ran to the back of the room. I watched the frequency monitor. The generator was oscillating at 59 hertz. I dialed the manual governor controls, watching the yellow waves slowly match the grid frequency. 59.8 hertz, 59.9, 60. Mark! I shouted. Audrey pulled the handle. A massive metallic thud shook the floorboards as the 2,000 amp breaker closed. The emergency lights stopped flashing, and the main room lights flared to full brightness. The deep, familiar hum of the transformers returned, vibrating through the soles of my boots. "We have power," Audrey gasped, looking at the screens. "But we are not safe yet," I said, looking at the temperature readouts for the smelting pots. They were at 821 degrees. The critical freezing point of the aluminum alloy was 820 degrees. We were literally 1 degree away from a $50 million disaster. I typed a sequence of override commands, forcing the system to dump maximum electrical current directly into the potline heaters. I pushed the load to 110% of its rated capacity. The console screen flashed red warning signs, signaling that the transformers were overheating. "Let them run hot," I said. "We can replace a transformer winding. We cannot replace 100 frozen smelters." We sat in silence watching the digital graphs. For 2 long minutes, the line remained flat at 821 degrees. Nobody breathed. Then, slowly, the number shifted. 822, 825, 830. The metal was melting again. The crust was breaking. "We saved it," Audrey said, collapsing back into her chair with a sigh of relief. "We did," I agreed, taking a sip of the terrible coffee Julian had left on the desk. The aftermath was swift. The board of directors officially terminated the consulting firm that afternoon. The automated cloud monitoring contract was canceled, declared void ab initio, because the consultants had misrepresented the software's capabilities and used my copyrighted software patches without authorization, exposing the company to millions in statutory copyright infringement damages under federal law. Julian Vance was permanently removed from operations. His father, Charles, called me personally from Florida to apologize. Julian was given a meaningless title in the archives department in the basement, where he could play with spreadsheets without endangering the company's survival. As for me, my new consulting contract makes me the highest paid person in the facility. I only work when I want to, spending most of my time teaching Audrey the hidden details of the electrical grid. People sometimes ask me if I was afraid of the risk I took when I flipped that switch. I just smile and tell them that danger is a calculated variable. If you know the math, you always control the outcome. And in this facility, I am the only one who truly knows the numbers.